All right, buckle up for today's deep dive. We're going back to 18th century New Spain, but not the glamorous parts you usually hear about. Forget the silver mines and palaces. We're heading to the rough and tumble northern frontier, Nueva Vizcaya,
Think modern-day Durango in Mexico, but way bigger, way wilder, and under constant threat.
a territory that massive needed some serious muscle to hold it together, right?
Absolutely, and that's where the Spanish military came in, specifically a network of forts called presidios.
And that brings us to the heart of today's deep dive. The letters of one very frustrated governor, Ignacio Francisco de Barrutia. This wasn't some, pen-pushing bureaucrat. Barrutia was a career soldier,
Yeah.
and he got thrown right into the fire of this frontier. And his letters, well, let's just say they give us a very different view of colonial power.
It's remarkable, really. You'd expect a governor, especially on the edge of the empire like that, to be, well, mostly worried about indigenous uprisings, raids, that kind of thing.
Makes sense, right? I mean, that's what we usually picture with the frontier.
Right. And while those were definitely concerns for Barucha,
Mm.
his letters reveal a, well, almost more surprising struggle, a battle for authority.
Oh, interesting. So not so much against the indigenous peoples, but
Exactly. This was about maintaining control within his own ranks.
his own soldiers were giving him more headaches than the enemy.
That's what it looks like.
Okay, so to really get this, we need to rewind a bit, right? Set the stage.
Yeah, let's jump back to the early 1700s. The Spanish Empire, it was vast, powerful, but also stretched incredibly thin.
And those far-flung presidios like the ones Barucha was in charge of, I'm guessing those weren't exactly getting the royal treatment, were they?
Not exactly a glamorous post, no. Those remote presidios were often neglected, underfunded, seen as, well, not exactly where you sent your best and brightest.
So you're dealing with a bit of a morale issue from the get-go.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And as if things weren't tough enough already.
Oh, this doesn't sound good.
Well, there was a recent audit, and let's just say it didn't end well for the soldiers in those presidios.
Let me guess. Pay cuts.
100 pesos, to be precise.
Oof, that's gotta sting.
It did not go over well.
I can imagine. Soldiers aren't exactly known for their love of pay cuts.
And that's where Baruch's letters, they really become invaluable. He describes, in detail, soldier disobedience, lack of respect for authority. And remember, this is still a very hierarchical world.
You don't just talk back to your commanding officer in the 1700s.
Exactly. And there's a sense that these soldiers, they felt expendable by the empire, by their superiors, by Barucha himself.
So not a great environment to be leading in. So we've got our governor, Barucha, stuck between a rock and a hard place here, dealing with unhappy, underpaid soldiers who are barely following orders. What's his plan? Did they have like a 1-800 number for the viceroy back then?
I don't think a hotline to Mexico City was an option. Barucha had to think on his feet. And his letter, they show this fascinating mix of, like, pragmatism, right, but also almost desperation at times. Like, he's trying to wrangle this situation that's always threatening to, spin out of control.
Yeah, and speaking of things threatening to spin out of control, we've got to talk about the indigenous raids. This was a constant danger for these presidios, right?
Oh, absolutely. The northern frontier was a volatile place. And Barucha's letters, they actually use this really interesting word.
Oh, what's that?
He keeps describing these indigenous raiding tactics as being like duendes.
Duendes. Okay, now that definitely sounds a little creepy for those of us who aren't, fluent in 18th century Spanish slang.
Right. So duendes, they're these figures from Spanish folklore, mischievous spirits, sometimes even malevolent.
Think like those trickster spirits you hear about.
Exactly. Lurking in the shadows, that kind of thing.
So not exactly Casper the Friendly Ghost, then.
Not at all. And I think that's important. Because Baruch is using this almost supernatural language to describe the way these indigenous peoples were attacking.
Interesting. So painting them as almost like mythical beings.
In a way, he talks about these sudden attacks, warriors seeming to materialize out of thin air, and he keeps coming back to that word, like duendes.
I wonder if that was partly strategic on his part. Was he playing up the danger to try and get more resources from the crown?
Oh, I definitely think there was an element of that. Remember, he's sending these letters back to the king, to the viceroy, begging for better pay for his soldiers, more supplies, anything to strengthen those defenses.
Sure, because if the enemy is that scary and supernatural, well, you need more help to fight them.
Right. Describing them as almost mythical, it adds weight to his requests, it creates this urgency, plays on those existing anxieties back in Spain about the frontier.
So, smart political move on Baruch's part. But let's get back to those soldiers for a second. Playing up the danger might work to get you more money. But how do you deal with that insubordination day to day? I mean, he couldn't exactly threaten to throw them in jail.
No, he couldn't. And that's what's really interesting here. Barusha understood that true power, especially in this kind of volatile situation, it wasn't just about force.
He was more nuanced than that.
Much more. It was about, walking a fine line, keeping up appearances.
Maintaining that image of control.
Exactly, even when things were far more fragile than they seemed.
Which, knowing what we know about those unhappy soldiers, it was probably most of the time.
Probably. And that's where some of these, well, almost funny anecdotes in his letters pop up.
Like what?
There's this one where he publicly reprimands a local captain for overcharging soldiers.
So kind of like price gouging during a crisis.
Exactly. And Barusha, he makes a big show of dressing this guy down.
Was that just Barusha being a stickler for the rules?
Well, maybe partly, but I think it was also a calculated move.
Okay, how so?
He's demonstrating his authority, right? But he's also showing those soldiers, look, I'm on your side. I've got your back.
Even if he's struggling to keep them in line at the same time.
Exactly. Classic balancing act.
So Barusha's trying to manage these unruly soldiers. He's appealing to the higher-ups for help, all while dealing with these, as he put it, duende-like indigenous raids. It's a lot for one guy to handle.
It was. He couldn't do it alone, and that's where his relationships within that Presidio network, they become really crucial.
Okay, so who are the other key players in this story?
Well, there's one name that keeps popping up in his letters, Joseph de Barotaran.
Barotaran. Okay, and who was he?
Captain of the Conchos Presidio, and let me tell you, this guy was a piece of work.
Okay, so we left off with Captain Joseph de Barotaran. You said he was a piece of work, which, knowing how wild this whole frontier situation was, is saying something. What made him so special?
Well, let's put it this way. Barotaran, he really understood that the edges of the Spanish Empire, especially a place like Nueva Vizcaya, well, things worked a little differently out there.
Different how? Gives it the dirt.
He had a reputation, effective against those indigenous raids, definitely. But he was also pretty deep into some smuggling rings.
Smuggling, huh? So not exactly by the book, then?
Not exactly. And we're not talking, a few trinkets here and there. These were large-scale operations, the kind that probably involved some powerful people further up the chain.
Whoa. So Baruch is relying on this guy, this captain, who's potentially breaking the law on a massive scale.
It might sound crazy, but that's exactly why Baruch's letters are so fascinating. They highlight this inherent contradiction within colonial power.
So it's less black and white, more shades of gray.
Exactly. On one hand, you have Barusha, a stickler for authority, frustrated with his own soldiers for being insubordinate. And yet, he needs people like Baridran, captains who can command respect, get things done, and maybe, just maybe, look the other way when it's beneficial for everyone.
It's a good reminder that things are rarely as simple as they seem on the surface.
Exactly. And that's something we can't lose sight of.
Especially when we're talking about history. It's easy to get caught up in the big events, the famous names.
Right, it's all about those official narratives.
But then you get these glimpses behind the curtain, these personal stories, and they completely change how you understand the past.
Like with Barusha and those letters, yeah, he was a governor, he had some power, but he was also this guy stuck in a really tough spot, trying to make the best of a messy situation.
Human, after all.
Exactly. And I think that's why these letters are so valuable. They remind us that history, it's not just about dates and battles. It's about the choices people made within these really complex and, let's be honest, often brutal systems.
Systems that were often built on these contradictions, like we see with Barotaran.
Exactly. So next time you read about empires, about colonization, about these grand historical forces.
Remember Barusha? Remember those duendes he was so worried about? The underpaid soldiers. The captains playing both sides.
Look for those cracks in the facade, because that's where the real story is.
That's where you find the human side of history. And that's where things get really interesting.